By the beginning of 1815, the man who had once rearranged the map of Europe was a prisoner on a tiny Mediterranean island called Elba. Napoleon Bonaparte, the former emperor of the French, had been stripped of his titles and forced into exile, while the Bourbon monarchy was restored to the throne in Paris. But the eagle was not yet dead. From his villa at Portoferraio, Napoleon watched as the Congress of Vienna descended into bickering and as the French people grew increasingly resentful of the returning aristocrats who sought to erase the gains of the revolution. He knew that the window of opportunity was closing. On the night of February 26, 1815, under the cover of darkness, Napoleon slipped away from Elba with a small fleet of 7 ships and about 1,000 men of his old guard. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. If he were intercepted by the British or Royalist French patrols, he would likely be executed or imprisoned in a far more remote location. After 3 days at sea, he landed on the coast of southern France, near Caen. Instead of marching directly north where the Royalist defenses were strongest, he chose the route Napoleon through the rugged Alps to avoid detection. As he moved inland, he faced the ultimate test of his charisma and the loyalty of the French army. Near the town of Laffrey, he encountered the 5th Regiment of the line sent to arrest him. The soldiers stood with their muskets leveled at their former commander. In a moment of pure, calculated theater, Napoleon stepped forward alone and bared his chest to the troops. He shouted that if there was any soldier among them who wished to kill his emperor here, he was. The silence was broken not by a gunshot, but by a roar of "Vive l'Empereur" as the soldiers broke ranks to embrace him. This scene repeated itself town after town. Marshal Ney, who had famously promised King Louis XVIII that he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, found himself unable to resist the pull of his old master and joined the march instead. By the time Napoleon reached the Tuileries Palace in Paris, the king had fled, and the emperor had reclaimed his throne without firing a single shot. This bloodless coup is one of the most remarkable feats in military and political history. However, the great powers of Europe were not moved by the popular acclaim of the French people. At the Congress of Vienna, they declared Napoleon an outlaw and an enemy of world peace. They did not declare war on France, they declared war on Napoleon personally. He knew that he had only a few months to rebuild the Grande Armée before the combined forces of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia descended upon his borders. He attempted to sue for peace, promising that he had returned as a changed man who wanted only to rule a constitutional France, but his letters were returned unopened. The gamble that began on the shores of Elba had now led him to the inevitable conclusion on the fields of Belgium. He realized that his only hope was to strike the Allied armies individually before they could unite. This led to the Waterloo campaign, where the luck that had carried him from exile finally ran out against the stubborn lines of the Duke of Wellington and the timely arrival of the Prussians. The escape from Elba remains the ultimate testament to Napoleon's belief in his own destiny and his unparalleled ability to command the devotion of his men. It was a journey from the abyss of defeat back to the pinnacle of power, and even though it ended in final exile on the remote rock of St. Helena, the 100 Days remains the most daring chapter in the Napoleonic legend. He proved that even a man with nothing can reclaim an empire if he has the audacity to seize the moment and the principles of leadership to inspire a nation to follow him into the unknown. As Napoleon marched deeper into the heart of France after his landing at Golfe-Juan, he was not merely leading a military column, but conducting a masterclass in psychological warfare and political subversion. The Bourbon government in Paris initially treated the news of his escape with derision, calling him a common bandit, but as the reports filtered in of entire garrisons defecting to his side, the laughter turned to cold terror. The Flight of the Eagle, as it came to be known, was a race against time where Napoleon had to reach Paris before the European powers could coordinate a military response. He avoided the royalist stronghold of the Rhone Valley and instead took the treacherous mountain paths of the high Alps, often walking on foot alongside his soldiers to demonstrate his shared hardship. This physical presence was a powerful contrast to the sedentary and obese King Louis XVIII, who was seen as a puppet of foreign powers. Every village Napoleon entered became a theater of revolution. He would stop to speak with local peasants and veterans of his former campaigns, reminding them of the glory they had shared and the land rights the returning aristocrats were threatening to take away. By the time he reached Grenoble, the gates were locked against him, but the inhabitants and the soldiers inside began to tear down the wood and stone to let him in. It was here that Napoleon famously remarked that before Grenoble he was an adventurer, and after Grenoble he was a prince. The momentum was now unstoppable. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, was sent with a massive force to intercept him, but Ney's own soldiers were humming the tunes of the Empire and wearing their forbidden tricolor cockades under their white royalist hats. When Ney finally met Napoleon, he did not arrest him. He embraced him effectively, delivering the heart of the French army back to its true commander. In Paris, the king realized that the very soldiers meant to protect him were waiting for the signal to switch sides, and he fled toward the Belgian border in the middle of the night. On March 20th, 1815, Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace, carried up the stairs by a jubilant crowd of officers and citizens. He had reclaimed an empire without spilling a single drop of French blood. However, the reality of his situation was grim. He found the treasury nearly empty and the nation surrounded by a coalition of over 700,000 soldiers preparing to invade. Napoleon immediately pivoted from the role of a conqueror to that of a constitutional monarch. He tasked Benjamin Constant with drafting the Additional Act to the constitutions of the empire, which granted greater press freedom and parliamentary power in an attempt to win over the liberal middle class. But his primary focus was the Commission of the Army. He worked 18 hours a day to revitalize the military manufacturing sectors, requisitioning horses, and calling up the veterans of previous wars. He managed to increase the standing army from 200,000 to nearly 300,000 in just 10 weeks. He knew that the five forces of his time, the debt of the French state, the internal conflict between Republicans and Royalists, the external rivalry with the Seventh Coalition, the harsh climate of the coming campaign season, and the technological edge of his artillery, were all converging on a single point in Belgium. He was no longer the young general of Italy or the master of Austerlitz. He was a man racing against his own health and the overwhelming numbers of his enemies. He decided that the only way to save France was a preemptive strike. He would drive a wedge between the British under Wellington and the Prussians under Blücher, defeating them in detail before the Austrians and Russians could arrive on the Rhine. This was the logic that led to the bloody crossroads of Quatre Bras and the heights of Ligny. Napoleon was playing a high-stakes game of probability where a single mistake or a single hour of delay could mean the end of his dynasty. He believed in his star, but the mechanical reality of the big cycle was turning against him. The European powers had learned from their past defeats. They had adopted his own divisional structures and his own aggressive tactics. As the Grande Armée crossed the Sambre River into Belgium, Napoleon was not just fighting for a throne, but for the survival of the revolutionary ideals he represented. The gamble of Elba had succeeded in its first phase, but the final act was about to be written in the mud and smoke of Waterloo. This was the ultimate test of a leader's ability to reshape reality through sheer force of will, even when the tides of history were pulling in the opposite direction. Napoleon knew that he was a man of destiny, but even the greatest of men must eventually face the limitations of the machine they have built. The eagle had taken flight one last time, but the sky was darkening with the storm clouds of a continent united against him. By June of 1815, the flight of the eagle had transformed into a desperate race against the industrial and military might of a united Europe. While Napoleon had successfully reclaimed the Tuileries, His political foundation was far more fragile than it had been during the height of the empire in 1807. To silence his critics and consolidate the support of the middle class, he presided over the Champ de Mai on June 1, 1815, a massive theatrical ceremony on the Champ de Mars where he swore an oath to the new Additional Act of the Constitution. Dressed in imperial robes but surrounded by the symbols of a constitutional monarchy, he attempted to reconcile his past as a dictator with his new promise to be a liberal leader. However, the grand spectacle could not hide the reality that nearly 1 million enemy soldiers were marching toward the French borders. The Seventh Coalition had made it clear that there would be no peace as long as Bonaparte remained in power. Napoleon knew that the five forces were now arrayed against him in a way that left almost no margin for error. His internal order was threatened by royalist insurrections in the Vendée. His external rivalry with the British and Prussians was reaching its boiling point, and his financial resources were being drained to outfit his newly formed Army of the North. On June 12th, he left Paris to join his troops near the Belgian border, embarking on a campaign that would decide the fate of Europe in a matter of days. His strategy was classic Napoleonic maneuver, the strategy of the central position. He aimed to drive a wedge between the Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher. On June 16th, he achieved a partial success, defeating the Prussians at Ligny, while Marshal Ney fought a bloody stalemate against Wellington at Quatre Bras. But the machine of the French army was starting to malfunction. Poor communication and a lack of clear staff work led to an entire corps marching back and forth between the two battles without engaging in either, a mistake that allowed the Prussians to escape total destruction. On the morning of June 18th, Napoleon stood on the heights of Rossomme, overlooking the valley where Wellington had positioned his troops near the village of Waterloo. The heavy rains of the previous night had turned the ground into a quagmire, forcing Napoleon to delay his attack until the soil dried so he could move his superior artillery. This delay was a fatal blow. It gave the defeated but resilient Prussians under Blücher the time they needed to reorganize and march toward the sound of the guns. The Battle of Waterloo was a pounding match of unprecedented intensity. Napoleon launched wave after wave of infantry and cavalry against the stubborn British squares, but the ground remained soaked and his tactical options were limited. In a final, desperate move, he sent in his invincible old guard, the soldiers who had never lost a battle, to break Wellington's center. But as the guard ascended the slope, they were met with a devastating hail of musket fire and were forced to retreat for the first time in their history. The cry of "La Garde recule," or "The Guard is retreating," sent a shockwave of panic through the French ranks just as the Prussian columns emerged from the woods on the French right flank. The gamble had failed. Napoleon fled back to Paris, hoping to raise a second army, but the political will of the nation had finally snapped. He was forced to abdicate for the second time on June 22, 1815. His final attempt to escape to America was blocked by a British naval blockade at Rochefort, and he surrendered to the captain of the HMS Bellerophon. The man who had escaped Elba to reclaim an empire ended his life as a prisoner on the desolate rock of St. Helena, thousands of miles from the continent he had once dominated. Yet even in defeat, he won the battle for history. During his 6 years on St. Helena, he dictated his memoirs and crafted the Napoleonic legend, portraying himself as a champion of the people and a martyr for European unity. The escape from Elba remains the most audacious episode of his career, a 100-day epic that proved that while a leader can seize power through brilliance and charisma, no man can indefinitely outrun the mechanical cycles of debt, war, and the shifting tides of the global order. Napoleon's greatest gamble was ultimately a losing one, but it remains the ultimate study in the power of the human will to challenge the inevitable.